The Lord be with you. Today we're going to be thinking about the Feast of the Epiphany. And according to the dictionary, the word Epiphany means a moment of sudden and great revelation or realization. So a moment when suddenly something's revealed to you, or you suddenly understand something for the first time. Perhaps you can see how that word came to refer to the wise men's visit to the infant Jesus, according to the story that's told in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, and how they recognised in this tiny, insignificant baby born to a poor Jewish couple the greatest king the world would ever know, and a king not just of the Jews, but of the whole world, of every nation, one who was worthy of their gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. I'm going to read you a version of that story now, and as I read it, I want you to listen and be able to say at the end, how many kings are there in the story? So how many kings are there? Far across the desert, wise men watched a new star burst into the night sky and knew it was a sign from God that a great king had been born. They followed the star to Jerusalem. "Where can we find the newborn king?" they asked. King Herod was shocked to hear about a new king. "Will he take my throne?" he wondered. "Come back to me when you have found the child," he told the wise men as he hatched a plan to get rid of this baby. So they continued on their way, following the star to Bethlehem, where they found Jesus in his mother's arms. The wise men bowed down to the baby king and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But an angel warned the wise men not to tell Herod where the child was. So when they left Bethlehem, they travelled back home by a different road. Well, I wonder how many kings you thought there were in that story. 3, 4, 5, 12? In fact, all those answers have been proposed by different people throughout the centuries. But I think there were just 2 kings mentioned: King Herod and Jesus himself. The Magi weren't kings, but astrologers, men who studied the stars and tried to interpret their meaning. So despite all the paintings and carols we sing that suggest the contrary, I think there are just 2 kings mentioned in Matthew's story. You can see why we think they're kings, of course, because the paintings tend to look a bit like that, don't they? And give them crowns. Herod was the puppet king placed in charge of Judea by the Romans, and known more accurately as Herod the Great, and he ruled for 40 years. Not as long as our own queen, but he ruled for a long time. He could be generous, but he was also feared and hated, and he could be a terrible tyrant. He isn't shown in a good light in Matthew's Gospel, and he suffered from terrible paranoia, having even his own close family murdered if he thought they might try and take his throne from him. No one in their right minds is threatened by a baby, but he was horrified at this story of a newborn king, and as you read on in Matthew's Gospel, you hear how he set out to destroy him. Herod is exposed through his actions as a false king. He pretends that he wants to come and worship too if the wise men will come back and tell him where Jesus is. But in fact, it is only the Magi, the wise men from another country, that bow down and worship. You could say that it's the pagan elite who recognise Jesus for who he is and become true worshippers, because the Judean elite, represented here by Herod, oppose him. And for Matthew, the writer of the Gospel, there is only one true king, and that, of course, is Jesus. And the wise men who we remember each Epiphany point us to Jesus, King of all the nations. The story also paints a stark contrast in opposing choices. King Herod, who clings to his own power and status and ruthlessly eliminates anyone who might threaten that, and Jesus, who lays down his heavenly glory to become the servant of all, being born as a baby. Which king will you serve in your own choices this year? As we make our choices about how to live and what kind of a king we will serve, you might like to know of the old tradition of marking the door or doorway of a church or house with the letters CMB, usually with chalk in tradition at Epiphany, and that tradition is centuries old. Here's an example made with buttons rather than chalk. Can you see that spells out the letters CMB? You could say those letters represent the names Caspar, Melchior and Balthazar, which we've given to those three wise men. But they also represent the Latin inscription Christus mansionem benedicat, Christ bless the house. So this year, as we spend so much more time in our houses, this seems like a really good tradition to adopt. Maybe you'd like to make a lovely poster for your classroom or for your bedroom with the letters CMB. And as you look at it, remember the story of the wise men who knelt to worship Jesus as their king, and pray the prayer that the letters spell out. Christ bless this house. Amen.